In the last lecture, we created a database in Firebase. So if we go to Firebase, here we have created a database and currently this database is empty and this is the URL for that database. Now the next step is to create a collection in this database and add some records in that collection. Now in order to create a new record in the database, first we are going to take some input from the user and based on that input, we will create a new record in the database. And to gather the input from the user, here I have created a brand new Angular project. Currently in this project, this is the landing page. So in the landing page, we are going to show all the tasks which the user has created. Currently, I'm showing a dummy task here. Now we can click on this create task button. It will open a form. In this form, we can enter some details. For example, the title for the task may be task 1, the description for the task, then whom this task should be assigned to, when this task is created, the priority of the task, and also the status of the task. So whether the task is still open or someone has started working on that task, whether it is in progress or whether the task is complete. So we can also specify the status of that task. And when the user clicks on this create task button, we want to send an HTTP post request to the server with the data, the input which the user has entered in this form. Okay, and based on this data, a new record should be created in a collection in the Firebase database. Now, if we go to VS Code, here we have our project. If I expand this source folder, there we have the app folder. In the app folder, if I go to app component.html file, there you will notice that I'm using the selector of header component. I'm using the selector of footer component. And in between the header and footer, we are displaying the view of dashboard component. So here I have the header component, here I have the footer component. Now these are not that important right now, but here we have our dashboard component. If I expand this dashboard component and if I go to the HTML of this dashboard component, this is the HTML for that dashboard component. Okay, and at the top you will notice that we are using another component called app create task. So basically the component name is create task and the selector for that component is app create task. So here we are using another component and after that we are writing some HTML to show this view. Okay. Now when we click on this create task button, we are basically going to render the view of this create task component. So if I go to create task component, let's open the HTML of this create task component. There we are writing some HTML in order to display that form. So here you can see we are creating a form. In that form, we have an input for title. We have an input for description. So we have this text area for description. We have an input for assigned to. Now here, let me change this type to text. It should not be number. All right. Here we have an input for created at. Then we have a drop down for priority and we have a drop down for status. Then we also have this button create task. And currently this form is a simple HTML form. Currently, it is neither a template-driven form nor a reactive form. It is a simple HTML form. Now, we have learned that in order to work with forms in Angular, we either create a template-driven form or a reactive form. So here what we are going to do is, we are going to convert this form into a template-driven form, and then we are going to work with it. You can also use reactive form for the same if you are comfortable with the reactive form approach. I have already covered how to create a reactive form and read the input values from a reactive form in one of the previous section of this course. So you can refer that section as well if you want to go with reactive form approach. But here I am going to make use of template driven form. Now in order to change this form into a template driven form, the first thing which we need to do is in the app module, inside this imports array, we need to import forms module from angular/forms. So I'll select this forms module and it will auto import forms module from angular/forms. Let's save the changes. This is the first change we need to do in order to create a template driven form. Then on each of these inputs, we need to add a name attribute. And here, let's call it maybe title. Let me copy this name attribute and let me add it on other elements as well. So on this text area also, I'm going to add this name attribute and I'm going to call it description. Then here on this input element, I'm going to add the name attribute and I'm going to call it assigned to. Then here let's add the name attribute and there let's call it created at. Then on this select also, let's add a name attribute and here let's call it priority. And on this select also, let's add a name attribute and let's call it status. So basically, with these names, a property will be created in the ngForm object, right? We already know this from our previous lectures. So this is the second step. We need to add a name attribute. And then we also need to add ng model directive on each of these input elements. So after adding name attribute, let me also go ahead and let me add ng model directive on each of these elements, each of these form fields. All right. So we have added the name attribute and we have also added the ng model. Now next, what we are going to do is on this form, I am going to create a template reference variable. I am going to call it maybe task form. You can name it anything. And to this, I am going to assign ng form. So as we already know, what this ng form will do is it is a directive which is going to store a template driven form. In this case, as soon as we imported the forms module from Angular/forms, Angular will find this form tag in our application and it will convert this form into a template driven form. And this ng form directive, it is going to store a reference to that template driven form. And we are assigning that reference to this task form template reference variable. Finally, what I'm also going to do is I'm going to set the type of this button as submit. That means whenever this button will be clicked, this form will be submitted. And whenever the form will be submitted, an event called ng submit will happen. So I'm going to bind that ng submit event. And whenever this ng submit event will happen, we want to execute some logic. So here I'm going to call a function. I'm going to call that function maybe on form submitted. Okay. And to this on form submitted, we are going to pass this template reference variable. Right. Now let's go ahead and let's create this method, this on form submit method in the create task component class. So let's go ahead and let's open this create task component.ts file. There, I'm going to create this method on form submitted. And we know that in this method, we are going to receive an argument. So I'm going to call it maybe form. You can name it anything. And the type here is going to be ng form. And in order to use this ng form, and this n should be in caps here. In order to use this ng form, we need to import it from Angular/forms. So let's write that import statement here. Okay, now what we are going to do is, first of all, we are simply going to log the form object which we are going to receive for this form parameter. So this form parameter, it is going to store an instance of this ng form. Let's go ahead and let's simply log that instance in the console. So let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Let me open developer console. Let's clear everything. Let me click on this create task button. The form is opened. Let's enter a title, a description. Let's assign it to maybe John. Let's select created date. Let's select the priority as medium and let's say the status is open. Let's click on this create task button and you will notice that an instance of this ng form has been logged here. If I expand this ng form object, in there we will have a value property and this value property is an object, and in that object for each of these controls a property has been created and that property is assigned with the value which we have entered in those controls. So now what I'm going to do is, instead of logging form, we are going to log form dot value. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. Let me again click on this create task button. Let's enter some details. And when I click on this create task button, before that, let me clear the console. You can see that an object has been logged. And in that object, for each of these controls, we have these properties. So it is this object, it is this data which we want to send to the server. And with this data, we want to create a new record in the database. Okay, now we are going to make HTTP requests from this dashboard component class. Okay, we are not going to make HTTP requests from this create task component class. So what we need to do is we need to pass this data to dashboard component class. Now, how we are going to do that? For that, we are going to create a new event. For that, let's first use this at output decorator. Now, let's create a property. Let's call it maybe emit task data. You can name it anything. Okay, it is going to be of type event emitter. And what type of data it is going to emit? It is going to emit task data. So for now, what I will do is I'll simply set it as any. And then we will create a new model class for the task object. But before that, let's instantiate this event emitter here. Okay, again, for now, I'll simply say any. All right, so here we are creating an event called emit task data. And whenever this event will be emitted, with that event, we are going to emit the task data, which the user will enter in this form. All right, now when do we want to emit this event? We want to emit this event whenever the submit button in the form is clicked. And whenever the submit button in the form is clicked, we are calling this on form submitted method. So here itself, I am going to emit that event, this emit task data event. For that, on this, we are going to call the emit method. And what data do we want to emit? We want to emit form.value. Okay, so basically it is going to emit the value object from the ng form object. Now here we are setting the type as any, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a model class. So for that, in the app folder, let me create a new folder. I'll call it as model. In this model folder, I'll create a new file and I'll call it as task.ts. Okay, here let's go ahead and let's create and export a class. Let's call this class task. And in here, I'm going to create a constructor. And inside this constructor, I'm going to specify some parameters. So for example, we are going to have a title property here. So I'll create a public parameter. I'll call it title. It is going to be of type string. Then we also want a description property. So again, I'm going to create a public property called description. This is also going to be of type string. Then we also want to have assigned to property. It is also going to be of type string, and let's also use public in front of it so that behind the scenes a public property called assigned to will be created. Okay, and it is again going to be of type string. Then again we are going to create another property created at, and this created at, again I'm going to set it as string. Okay, I'm not going to set it as date time, but I'm going to set it as string because the value which the user will select from the UI, we are going to receive that value as a string value. All right, then we also want to have a priority property, which is going to be of type string. And again, I'll use public in front of it so that behind the scenes, a public property called priority will be created. And we also want to have a status property. And this is also going to be of type string. All right. So these are the properties which we are going to have for this task class. So every time we create an instance of this task class, it is going to have these 6 properties. Now let me save the changes in this file. Let's go back to create task component. Okay, and here instead of setting the type as any, we are going to set it as task. And in order to use this task class, we also need to import it from this file path. Okay, in the same way here also, instead of using any, let's set the type as task. All right, so every time the submit button in the form will be clicked, this event will be emitted. Now what we are going to do is we are going to bind this event in the parent class. So this create task component, it is a child of dashboard component. So if I open dashboard component.html, there at the top, we are calling the selector of create task component. Okay. And on that, we are using this ngIf directive. We are also listening to this close form event of this create task component. In the same way, let's also go ahead and let's bind the emit task data event. And whenever this emit task data event happens, let's say we want to call a function. And here we are going to call a function, let's call it maybe create task. Okay, so in the child component, we have this event emit task data. We are binding this event in the parent component. So in the parent component, we are using the selector of that child component, and there we are binding this emit task data event. So whenever this emit task data event will happen, we are going to call this create task method. Okay, now let me make this D in uppercase, and here also let's make this D in uppercase. Then here also we need to change it to uppercase. All right, let's go back to dashboard component.html. So whenever this emit task data event will happen, we are going to call this method. And to this method, we are also going to pass the data which this event is going to emit. So here, let's pass $event. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's create this method in the component class. So let's go to dashboard component.ts file. There, let's create this method, create task. And here we are going to receive some data. I'll simply call it as data, and it is going to be of type task. And in order to use it in this dashboard component, we also need to import it from this file. Okay, and all we are going to do is we are going to log it in the console. So here first I will specify the component name. So let's simply say dashboard, and then I'm going to also log this data parameter. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Let me clear everything here. Let's click on this create task button. Let's enter some details, and let's click on this create task button. So you see, from the dashboard component also, an object is being logged. Now here you're seeing this object because we are concatenating this object, this data object with a string. So this value, it is converted to a string. If I remove this string value from here, in that case, it will log the object stored in this data property. So now if I save the changes and if we go back to the web page, let's open the form, let's enter some details, and let's click on this create task button. So you see, the object is being logged 2 times. This object here, it is being logged from the dashboard component. So in this way, we are able to pass data from the create task component to dashboard component. Now from here, we are going to make an HTTP post request to the server from this dashboard component. And we are going to do it in our next lecture. Now before we wrap up this lecture, what I also want is, once the submit button is clicked, I want to close this form. Okay. For that, in the create task component, we have this close form event. So I'm going to call this close form event. So you see, when this button is clicked, we are emitting this close form event. Okay, and with that, we are emitting a Boolean value, like you can see here. In the same way, when the submit button is clicked, that time also we want to close the form. So I'm also going to emit this close form event after the value which the user has entered in the form that has been emitted. So for now, let's remove this console.log statement. And once the value is emitted from this onForm submitted event, let's also call this close form event. And from here, I'm going to emit a Boolean value false. All right, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. So when I click on this create task, you see the form is opened. When I click on this create task button again, the form is closed. So it is working as expected. Let's close this developer console here. So the form is opened. When I click on this cross button, the form is closed. And now when I click on this create task button, that time also the form is closed. So in this lecture, we created a template driven form. We read the value the user has entered in that template driven form, and then we pass that value from the create task component to the dashboard component. Now from the dashboard component, so let me close this create task component here. Let's also close this dashboard component.html here, and let's close this task.ts. So from this dashboard component, inside this create task method, now we are going to make a post request to the server, and with that post request, we are going to send this data with the request body. And using this data in the database, we are going to create a new record, and we are going to do it in our next lecture.